As One Piece has progressed from Wano, two things have become clear. First, that Gear 5th is going to be the norm for pretty much all Luffy fights from here on. And second, that the goofy tone and joyful persona are here to stay as well. And this has begged the question yet again, does Gear 5th mean that Luffy's fights are no longer going to have the tension and atmosphere that they once did? This single question has produced an absurd amount of poor arguments from readers on both sides. On one hand, from those who hate Gear 5th and are using every opportunity to claim that it is ruining the story while ignoring context, as well as on the other hand, from fanboys who are obstinately pretending that Gear 5th hasn't changed anything at all. Here's the reality. Yes, Gear 5th fundamentally changes the tone of Luffy's fights. However, whether it has been misused so far or will hurt the story in the future is an entirely different discussion. And since I'm sick of so many readers throwing around words like tension and tone while completely misusing them, it's time to actually break down the reality of how Gear 5th has affected these so far, and what it means for the future. To begin with, there are three objectively, provably incorrect arguments that readers make to blindly shut down any concerns surrounding Gear 5th. First, some claim that Gear 5th doesn't affect how serious the tone is at all. Second, some claim that even though Gear 5th does make fights more silly than serious, well, Luffy's fights have always been silly and therefore Gear 5th changes nothing. And third, some claim that even though Gear 5th is mainly comedic, it's already been demonstrated that Gear 5th can still be made serious whenever the story requires. These three flawed arguments need to be addressed first, before then addressing the real arguments that matter. First, whether the changes in tone have been positive for the story so far. Second, whether they are true to the story of One Piece and Luffy's journey each arc. And third, whether the tone Gear 5th sets can hold up in future contexts that we will see by the end of the series. But first, I wanted to offer you all an amazing deal for 20% off the best men's grooming kit in the world. Manscaped, the sponsor for this video. So I need you to answer me honestly. How often do you shave down there? And how difficult is it to shave your balls? We all know it's a huge hassle, you have to be careful, it takes time, and it's hard to be thorough. That's why Manscaped has developed an advanced razor that makes it completely fast and painless. It's the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra, equipped with next-gen dual skin-safe blade heads, now accompanied by an updated trimmer blade and an interchangeable foil blade for enhanced performance. This is a razor literally developed to make manscaping quick, easy, and painless for you, and leave you feeling smooth and fresh. And it's not just the razor, Manscaped is offering the complete package, with the crop soother and crop preserver. So that means a moisturizer and a deodorant specifically for your private parts, so you feel good and smell good before any activities that you might be getting up to. On top of all that, you even get the Weed Whacker 2.0 ear and nose hair trimmer, and 2 free gifts thrown in. First gift is the fully organized grooming toolbox for all your equipment, and second is my personal favorite, it's the Manscaped Boxers, which are made out of the comfiest, sleekest material that I've ever worn. So for that whole package, Manscaped is offering a huge discount on the entire thing for my viewers right now. When you use my promo code MORGE, you'll get 20% off the full package, plus free international shipping, plus the 2 free gifts. So just head over to manscaped.com and get your hands on the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra today. That's 20% off, plus free shipping and 2 free gifts with promo code MORGE at manscaped.com. So that aside, to begin with, the first bad Gear 5th defense that I see is that Gear 5th does not affect the tone. This claim is pretty much insane. To begin with, Gear 5th is very literally composed entirely of comedic attacks. Straight up slapstick gags, it turns the entire battle scene into something reminiscent of a Saturday morning cartoon. These moments are very clearly supposed to be silly. In absolutely no universe is Oda drawing this to be a serious panel. Now, an absolute simple, universal, grade school level writing 101 truth that is undebatable is that comedy and tension are opposites. They are in direct opposition to one another. If you have a particularly tense scene, then the point of inserting a comedic moment is to briefly cut the tension. Oftentimes, if a story is getting too serious, that's when a writer may insert a mild joke to relieve the tension a bit. That's literally what the term comic relief means. This simple truth that comedy cuts tension, and that tension is built up specifically by not undercutting it with comedy, is so fundamentally basic that it is insane that I'm having to explain it here, but apparently it's necessary because I have legitimately seen some people try to argue that Gear 5th doesn't inherently undercut tension. It does. In fact, literally Literally the entire point is cutting tension. The literal motivation of Oda to write Gear 5th was explicitly, in his own words, to make it so fights are not as serious. That is why the form exists. Gear 5th as a form that is a continuous string of jokes and gags inherently by definition makes fights less serious. If you think the tone that Gear 5th sets is serious, then you are objectively incorrect, not subjectively but objectively, as tone is objectively defined as the intent of the author, and Oda's stated intent with Gear 5th is to make fights less serious. So if you truly love Gear 5th, then don't fight it. Embrace its purpose. I don't understand why some people try to claim that Gear 5th doesn't undercut tension, as it exists to make a very serious situation lighthearted and silly, and to bring a smile to the faces of both the characters and the reader. That is, in fact, a strength that will be discussed later in the video. Now, the second bad Gear 5th defense that I've seen is the claim that Luffy's fights have always been silly. And this is just how Luffy always is, therefore Gear 5th doesn't change anything. I've even seen some people go so far as to claim that all of One Piece shouldn't be taken seriously. This argument bothers me because in a misguided attempt to defend a power-up, readers are undermining the value of the entire series and main character. It treats the totality of One Piece as though it's black and white, with zero variation or nuance to the wide range of tones that Oda shifts between, or the depth of Luffy and his actual emotional range that he displays. Because yes, One Piece is really funny, it's zany, it's lighthearted, and all of this is reflected in the main character. However, One Piece can also be intensely serious, intensely dramatic, and intensely real. And all of this is represented in the main character as well. If you've been paying any attention at all to the story, there is a single absolute common thread for the way that Luffy has always been written, which is that even though the majority of the time he's goofy and joking around, when the situation is dire, when things have become personal, that's when Luffy stops joking around, and he gets serious. Genuinely, if you don't understand this, then you need to reread the entire story, because you've missed the entire point of Luffy and who he is. The entire point is that underneath the comical exterior, there is another side to Luffy that comes out when it's time to stop joking around. And for the entirety of One Piece, this serious side has always been the side of Luffy that has taken center stage when it's time for the most dramatic fights. Literally think of every single one of Luffy's most significant fights before Kaido. Luffy vs. Lucci, Luffy vs. Katakuri, Luffy vs. Doflamingo, Luffy vs. Crocodile Round 3. Guess what? All of Luffy's longest, most high-stakes, most personal fights in the story prior to Kaido also all featured Luffy at his most serious. I'm sharing a bunch of panels here as a reminder, but I really shouldn't have to, because unless you have the memory of a goldfish, you should be able to remember that this is how One Piece has always been. And this is how Luffy has always been. For the highest stakes conflicts, we have always seen the most serious version of Luffy. This was the norm. The reality is, Gear 5th is completely different from what we've had before. It takes Luffy in the opposite direction. It's okay to acknowledge that, because guess what? Different isn't necessarily bad. I still consider Gear 5th to be one of the greatest additions to the story ever, but I'm not sitting here lying to myself pretending that it's not a hard left turn away from how the protagonist has previously been written in major battles. Now yes, it's true that you can also find a lot of Luffy's fights that feature him being more lighthearted and silly, but the reality is these fights also tend to be for arcs and villains that are more minor, and are generally for storylines that weren't that serious or personal for Luffy and the Straw Hats in the first place. All of the major arcs and conflicts that have highly emotional and highly personal storylines for Luffy and the Straw Hats, like Alabasta, Enies Lobby, Whole Cake Island, and so on, featured a fittingly serious Luffy for a fittingly dramatic final battle. I also find it strange that a lot of readers criticize fans who want a more serious Gear 5th by saying that that would be cringy or cliché. That must mean that you hate most of One Piece's greatest moments, because Oda is probably the best shonen writer ever at the quote-unquote cliché angle of portraying the rage and raw emotion of his protagonist and writing epic, serious battles around that. There is nothing cringe about that. That is in fact easily the greatest strength of Luffy's battles in the past. Readers have historically all loved the moments of Luffy being fueled by righteous fury. There's no need to shit on past One Piece just to defend Gear 5th's new approach. And the final flawed argument I've seen defending Gear 5th is that even though Gear 5th is generally comedic, well, we've already seen that it can be serious, as proven by Luffy's serious expression during Bajarang Gun. So on the one hand, yes, Luffy does at least stop smiling partway through the Bajarang Gun clash, but this is kind of the bare minimum, considering Gear 5th Luffy was all jokes and smiles for literally all of the chapters before this. Luffy then briefly putting on an angry face for just one punch doesn't really hold much dramatic weight, at least compared to past Luffy fights that actually committed to a serious tone from the start, as the hero's emotions of anger, desperation, and drive are vividly woven into every beat of the fight, building and digging into his pain and struggle, all finally culminating in a powerful crescendo of furious emotion. At the end of the day, build-up of a character's emotional state and sustained tone matters. I mean, there's a reason that literally every great fight in anime and every great fight in fiction actually commits to a serious emotion for the protagonist for the entirety of the battle, because that's inherently, fundamentally more dramatic than the hero goofing around and having fun the entire time before then briefly getting mad for one punch. So while Bajarang Gun definitely technically shows Luffy being more serious than he normally is in Gear 5th, it's still very clearly a far cry from the level of intensity that we've been accustomed to seeing from Luffy in previous iconic fights before Gear 5th. To be honest, there's even a lot of just random minor fights in One Piece that visibly feature a more intense, angry Luffy than we got during that one moment of Bajarang Gun, which makes sense because even in some of these minor fights, at least the preceding chapters built up Luffy's serious attitude over time before leading into the final blow. And all that aside, the bigger issue is that even bringing up Bajarang Gun as evidence that Gear 5th can be serious actually ironically hurts the overall argument, because if you think about it, out of all the zany, wacky abilities that Luffy used against Kaido in Gear 5th, Bajarang Gun is the one attack that actually isn't zany and wacky. It's pretty much just a traditional attack. There's nothing really funny about Bajarang Gun, it's just a giant, really powerful punch, pretty much the same as Gear 3rd or King Kong Gun, just bigger. If Gear 5th is mainly about Luffy fighting with cartoonish, reality-warping shenanigans, then it's kind of telling that the only moment that Oda could make somewhat serious in Gear 5th combat was by actually setting aside all of the Gear 5th gag moves and instead doing a straightforward shonen finisher. As I said at the beginning, comedy and tension are antithetical, and this is basically proven by the fact that the only moment in Gear 5th Luffy vs Kaido that featured a truly serious Luffy was also the moment that Oda didn't include Gear 5th's usual comedy. But then in the future, if Oda needs a full-on extended serious fight in Gear 5th, how would that work? Just cut out all the comedy the entire time? But in that case, what's even the point of Gear 5th if its real purpose is just to give Luffy giant limbs? So the big question we're finally at is, how does Gear 5th's comical fighting style work in the future to be compatible with times when a more serious tone is needed? Can we ever again get a full serious fight, like Luffy vs Crocodile Round 3 or Luffy vs Lucci? Well, let's break it down. Now that we've addressed the main bad arguments you see defending Gear 5th, we can actually discuss why a lot of the claims about how the future of tension in Luffy fights is ruined is also still likely overblown. So before we look at the future, we need to look at the past. The question that needs to be asked first is, has Gear 5th actually ruined anything in the story so far? I'd say definitely not. So far in Luffy vs Kaido, Luffy vs Lucci, and Luffy vs Kizaru, the tone that was set by Gear 5th actually worked really well. That's because, first and foremost, it needs to be understood that the tone doesn't always need to be serious. Sometimes the most powerful thing to do is, in fact, to break the tension. That is the power of Gear 5th, and that's something that I've personally embraced. After all, so many all-time great Luffy moments come when there is an extremely tense scene, and Luffy shows up to bring back hope and lighten the mood. These are moments where some comedy is 100% welcome. Gear 5th is just that same feeling dialed up to 11. And so far, I think that the moments in which Gear 5th have come have been moments precisely where breaking the tension would be ideal. We just got this long, tragic story of Bonnie and Kuma, We then see Bonnie continue to suffer as Saturn tries to eradicate her and her father. Through all this, the most powerful thing that could happen is getting to see Bonnie finally experience some joy and hope that can cut through all the darkness around her. In this moment, I feel that it is so much better for Bonnie to get to witness this dancing, laughing warrior of liberation that she's dreamed of, rather than an angry, serious version of Luffy. I think Luffy winning this fight while being his uplifting Gear 5th self fits the arc perfectly. Similarly, Luffy unveiling Gear 5th against Kaido came at a point where all hope seemed lost, and it definitely made for an extremely memorable moment to see the tone shift from despair to absurdity and humor so dramatically. Now you might be saying, but Morge, didn't you also say that all of Luffy's previous most iconic fights featured him at his most serious? So then why shouldn't that still be the case for recent arcs like Wano or Egghead Island, where supposedly the lighthearted Gear 5th works better? Well, because it's not as simple as serious equals good, we need tension, or Gear 5th good, we need to break tension. What matters the most contextually is how Luffy's own emotional journey has developed throughout the arc. Yes, Luffy's greatest fights before Wano featured a very serious Luffy, but that never came out of the blue. There's a reason we don't see the extremely serious, angry Luffy that often. It's always been reserved for arcs where there is a strong, driving, emotional storyline for Luffy and the Straw Hats throughout the arc. In Alabasta, in Enies Lobby, in Whole Cake Island, and to some degree for Luffy specifically towards the end of Dressrosa, in all of these arcs there are important, highly personal narrative events that slowly bring out the more serious side of Luffy, all of it leading to a final battle where he is much more serious than normal due to an accumulation of triggers. Egghead Island really hasn't had that. It's just been a casual arc for Luffy and the Straw Hats in general. There hasn't been any deeply personal inciting events for Luffy. There's not been any sort of emotional journey for him. I would expect Luffy at the climax of Egghead to act the way that he normally does and to fight with his usual lighthearted demeanor. Gear 5th fits perfectly for that right now. Similarly in Wano, for everything after Act 1, Luffy was laid back, light, and optimistic for the majority of the storyline. He was very literally party planning on the way to Onigashima. The attitude of him and his crew was fairly light all the way till the final battle, and Luffy was literally having fun and giggling fighting Kaido for dozens of chapters even before Gear 5th. It would feel really forced to try and turn this type of battle into an Enies Lobby level of drama for Luffy, because the emotional foundation just wasn't there. It wasn't written into the arc at all for Luffy. Reading Wano from start to finish, Gear 5th fits with the attitude that Luffy had pretty much the entire arc, and it fits with the tone Oda set throughout Onigashima. So if we look at the Gear 5th fights so far of Luffy vs Kaido, Luffy vs Lucci, and Luffy vs Kizaru, Gear 5th works for all of them because none of them would make sense to have a particularly angry or serious Luffy in the first place, as that's not the emotional journey Luffy was on in any of these arcs. In two situations in particular, it actually was a lot better for Luffy to show up with a lighthearted attitude to break the tension that had been built up. So understanding that context matters, and Oda has been using Gear 5th in fitting contexts so far, let's finally look ahead at the future. Is there some storyline coming up where we can expect or would at least desire a more serious emotional journey for Luffy, where he wouldn't be having fun and being in a good mood like against Kaido and Kizaru? I think everyone's first answer would be yes, against Blackbeard. We all know that Luffy has a deep-seated hatred for Blackbeard, likely even more so now that Ace is dead. We are likely to see a very serious, very angry Luffy against Blackbeard, one that wouldn't fit with Gear 5th's comedy whatsoever. And that's why it's perfect that Blackbeard has the power to negate Gear 5th's abilities in the first place. It doesn't matter what devil fruit you have, even the most powerful fruit in the world does not work against the Yami Yami no Mi. I don't think anyone needs to worry about Gear 5th hurting the tone of the Blackbeard fight, because Blackbeard is literally made to counter that. If anything, Luffy vs Blackbeard would likely be a lot more focused on Luffy's haki, as it was already foreshadowed that the true merit of a Pirate King is measured by one's haki. So thematically it would be fitting that the battle against Blackbeard to become Pirate King would be about haki rather than Luffy's devil fruit. On the other hand, other expected fights like Luffy vs Shanks, well, that's a friendly duel that would be perfectly fine with Gear 5th. Even something like Luffy vs. Emu would likely work with Gear 5th, as I doubt that Luffy vs. Emu would be that deeply personal of a fight for Luffy. Rather, it seems more likely to be somewhat similar to Luffy vs. Enel, where Enel was in for a surprise as his omnipotence was just completely foiled at every turn by the random ridiculous ability of his natural enemy. So I think Oda has Gear 5th planned out pretty well for the rest of the story. What that leaves us with is the one place that I do have difficulty imagining Gear 5th working out of all of Luffy's potential remaining fights, and that is against Akainu. I do genuinely have difficulty imagining how a form that's all about jokes and undercutting tension could produce a fittingly tense and dramatic battle against the murderer of Luffy's own brother. So for all the Gear 5th doubters, I will concede one potential concern for the future, and that is for the unconfirmed potential fight of Luffy versus Akainu. So all in all, does Gear 5th set a comical tone? Yes. Is this different from how Oda used to write Luffy's most significant fights? Yes. Has it yet been shown that Gear 5th can produce the same level of seriousness as Luffy's old fights? No. However, has Gear 5th been perfect for the scenarios and battles that Oda has crafted for it so far? Yes. Has it elevated the recent storylines it's been in? Yes. Is there reason to believe that it can work well within the contexts of at least the majority of remaining fights that Luffy will have in One Piece? I like to believe so, with the possible exception of Akainu. But let me know how you think Luffy vs. Akainu can work in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, then definitely like and subscribe. And you can get my extended thoughts on how Gear 5th's effect on Luffy's personality has changed one fundamental aspect of his fights in a way that no one discusses on my weekly podcast by supporting me on Patreon. Link in the description below.